Good morning, all of you. Here comes our new chapter, new interesting topic to discuss today. Are you all excited? Today we are going to discuss about deficit spending and public debt. Welcome to the lecture. In this chapter, we have 4 learning objectives. First, to explain how the federal government budget deficit occurs and define the public debt. The second objective is to evaluate the circumstances under which the public debt could be a burden to future generations. The third objective is to analyze the macroeconomic effects of government budget deficits. The fourth objective is to describe the possible ways to reduce the government budget deficit. We'll discuss each objective one by one. And if you have any questions, any of your ideas, any of your thoughts, you can share that on this topic in different sections like the Google Doc that I have shared with you. You can ask question over there. You can also post your views on the discussion board, and if you want, you can also post any new articles on this topic at tweet section. Feel free to contact me for any questions or any clarifications you need on this chapter. Let us start with our learning objective 1, that is to explain how federal government budget deficit occurs and define the public debt. So the first concept is government budget deficit. This happens if government spends more than it receives its taxes during a given period of time. So the government has to finance this shortfall somehow, right? So for that, what are the different possibilities? This deficit is actually financed by selling the government securities, which we call the bonds, like the US Treasury bills. The federal government also asks US and the foreign households, businesses, and other government to lend funds to cover up its deficit. The federal deficit is a flow variable because it is one defined for the specific period of the time, usually a year. Let us take an example. If government spends $500 billion more than it receives its revenue, the Treasury will obtain that $500 billion by selling 500 new Treasury bonds. Those who buy the Treasury bond lend funds to the US government and will receive the interest payment over the life of the bond plus the principal amount or the repayment of the entire amount which is lent. In return, the US Treasury receives immediate purchasing power. In the process, it also adds to its indebtedness to the bondholder. So the government is a borrower and they are liable to pay back to the bondholders. The second concept is government budget surplus. Okay, and when that happens? That happens when there is an excess of government revenues over government spending during a given period of time. So it's just the opposite of deficit. Since 1940, the US federal government has operated with a budget surplus in 13 years. In all other years, the shortfall of the tax revenues below the expenditure has been financed with borrowing. Not only there can be budget deficit or budget surplus, but also there is a situation called as balanced budget. It is a situation in which government spending is exactly equal to the taxes and revenues it collects during a given period of time. The next aspect is public debt. You have earlier learned about the stock concept or the stock variable, which is measured at a given point in time and changes from one time to another as a result of the government budget deficits or surplus. The total value of all the outstanding federal government securities is the public debt. For instance, as of January 1, 2014, one of the measure of public debt was about $12.9 trillion. During 2014, federal government operated at a deficit of $0.5 trillion, and as a consequence of it, as of January 1, 2015, the measure of the public debt increased to about $13.4 trillion. This is the figure which is indicating the federal budget deficit and surpluses since 1940. The federal budget deficit, or we can say the expenditure is in excess of the receipts, are in red, have been more common than the federal budget surplus. That is, the receipt is in excess of the expenditure, which is in green. So you can see the quantity of the federal deficit and federal surplus. So more running with deficit than the surplus. This is another figure which is indicating the federal budget deficit as expressed as a percentage of GDP. During early 2000, the federal budget deficit rose as a share of GDP and then declined somewhat until 2007, and then it increased dramatically until 2010. The negative values for 1998 to 2000 period designate budget surplus as a percentage of GDP during those years. Could federal government ever reduce its annual budget deficit by eliminating any kind of duplicative spending programs? What are your thoughts on this? Have a look at the resurgence of the federal government deficits. Why has the government budget that has slipped from a surplus which is equal to 2.5% of the GDP into a deficit of more than 2% of the GDP? Well, the answer to this is that the spending has increased more than its revenues. The spending has increased at a faster pace since the beginning of the century, particularly in the light of the bailout of the financial institutions and a sharp rise in the discretionary fiscal expenditures than during other decades since the World War II. The more complex answer also considered the government revenues. In 2001, the Congress and the executive branch slightly reduced the income tax rate, and in 2003 they also cut the capital gain tax rates and estate tax rates. Because the tax rates were reduced toward the end of the recession, when the real income growth was relatively low, government tax revenues were stagnant for a time. When economic activity began to expand in the middle of the first decade of the century, the tax revenue started rising at a pace closer to the rapid rate of growth of government spending. Then, later in that decade, the economic activity dropped significantly. Since 2011, the tax revenues has increased but have continued to be less than the government spending. As long as this situation persists, the US government will operate with budget deficits such as those which is observed in the recent years. There is a behavioral example. Will the taxpayers eventually force government spending cuts? Behavioral economists they found that when the ratios of taxes to national income reach a high threshold between 25% to 35%, tax paying voters begin to pay much closer attention to government spending levels. These voters will add pressures on legislative representatives and government officials to eventually bring down government budget deficits and reduce the public debt.